is a Hello, welcome to Walk in the Park. My name is Tony Ingram, and welcome to another episode of Walk in the Park. This is number 231, February 5th, 2020. If you want to see all my shows, go to my website, walkinthepark.tv. That's a URL, and you can see most of my episodes there. This time, we are going to go way up north of Cayuga Lake to a place called Howland Island. So here we are in the Finger Lakes, and you can see Ithaca down there in the lower right, the south end of Cayuga Lake. And then you can see the marker up there. It says Howland Island, north of the lake in what's called the Montezuma Wetlands. And there's a whole complex they call it. There's more closer in, although it's hard to see any landmarks that'll tell you where it is. If you know the little town of Savannah, that's on the left there. And so here's another map here showing the northern end of the lake with the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge up at the northern end of the lake, and then the town of Montezuma above that, and then the Montezuma Wetlands Complex. So a lot of people only know about the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, but there's a much larger area with a lot of state lands in the Montezuma Wetlands Complex. So this is if you look at the blue lines there, they outline this swampy area or lowland called Howland Island. And on the bottom, going to the lower left to the right, is the Erie Canal. And then you see another river going up north, going up above and looping back around. That is the Seneca River, which feeds the Erie Canal. And here's another map of it showing, you can see the waterways better, and also those dark areas are ponds that were built back during the CCC days, Civilian Conservation Corps days. So we're going to go to well, actually, let's see, we're going to go to the Montezuma Audubon Center. Now this land is, well, you'll find out more about this, but it's a nature center, interpretive center, and we went there on last month in January. There was a special program on the history of the Howland Island, which is part of the wetland complex, the Montezuma Wetland Complex. So let's go take a look at a talk given by their environmental educator, Alyssa Johnson. This is one of 3 talks that were given that day that encompass 2 hours, so I chose the final one, which is covers pretty much the last 90 years of the history of Howland Island, which is pretty interesting. A lot of people have not been there, but many have heard of it. And so let's just go right on in the Montezuma Center and Audubon Center, and we'll start up the program here. Coming right up here. Get it queued up. All right.
I also like to thank the Friends of the Montezuma Wetlands Complex. I know I see a lot of friends in here. So we have Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge to our south. That's what you see from the thruway. This building and the island and some other land we're going to be talking about, this building and this land is all owned by the state, by the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, but I work for Audubon, New York. So there's kind of 3 entities, the federal government, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, DEC, and Audubon that cooperatively manage and provide education and do a lot of habitat restoration and things like that, but we're supported by a completely separate nonprofit called the Friends of the Montezuma Wetlands Complex. So as Cheryl said, the island was sold to the people of New York State for $35,000. I broke that down by the acreage, and that was $9.72 per acre. The island was pretty run down at that point. There hadn't been much maintenance going on at that point. Some of the buildings that were standing still in the early 30s. But if you've ever been over to the island, you know that it's wooded from side to side, top to bottom. And look at it in this drawing. So a manager moved on to the island, the Van Wee family, and they started doing a lot of work with building ponds. So most of this island, if you remember back to what Cheryl was saying, was farmed and logged actually. And there were so this whole area, I'm not going to try to divert too much, but we have everything to thank for the topography here to the glaciers. We have a lot of wet areas. I'm sure you all know the Finger Lakes. The 11 Finger Lakes to our south were carved out by the glaciers. Off of the north end of Cayuga Lake, it's believed the lake, a historic lakeshore, may have extended all the way up this far, and that's evidenced by all of the very wet, marshy area from here south. We, settlers, moved in and did a great job of ditching, draining, putting in irrigation ditches, the barge canal, the dredging of the Seneca River helped suck a lot of water off the surface and dried it out for farming. So to restore that, which is now from here to present day, most of the wetlands that you see around Montezuma, northern Montezuma Wildlife Management Area, which is up here, and at the refuge, those are man-made wetlands. So the first digging started in the early 30s. They started raising partridges and turkeys, Hungarian partridges, which are not native. Okay, so the Island Farm Camp. Yes, it became a site for the Civilian Conservation Corps. There was about 200 men living there. The original roads are still there and are still used, but all other evidence is gone. And the CCC men really were responsible for the beginnings of Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, which was purchased and established in 1938, and much of the island impoundments up here, this direction. This was an aerial taken in 1938. That little red marker is where the CCC camp is. Here's the steel bridge, and here's Carn Cross Road. So you can see how much it was farmed in the 30s. Look at all that clear land. It's believed, what the DEC told me, is that up here may be the only old growth. All the other trees have grown in the last 100 years, or 90 years. Just want to take you through a day in the life. So Henry Shippers was, I read an account in this account, he was a resident of Wayne County and passed in 2007. For what's in here, this is what their rates were: paid $21 per month, $14 sent home, with leftover a little bit of pocket money, which actually $7 is probably a good chunk of change back in the 30s. The breakfast was at 7 a.m. They worked the entire day, ate lunch out in the field. Their clothing was furnished by the CCC. They had a 5-day work week, 6-month tour. They could re-enlist if they wanted to. They could leave on weekends, like Cheryl said. I read in here, there was a lot of hitchhiking going on to Auburn, but there was not great transportation, not great roads back then. So this is a article. Evidently, the Ducks thought the CCC program was good news. When the new ponds formed by dikes and dams constructed by the CCC boys began to appear, increasing numbers of waterfowl likewise appeared. This sounds weird, but it's verbatim. They made themselves at home when, during the course of construction, and bred upon the flooded areas, seemingly impatient for the work to be completed. Last season, over 70 broods of wild ducks, blacks, mallards, wood, blue-winged teal were reared by their own parents in the refuge. Gallinules, of which of 30 broods were counted, succeeded by their wild and raucous laughter and fairly outdoing the noisy pied-billed grebes. That is a gallinule that I took a picture of over by the island. Here's that stone with the plaque. It's a cool spot. It's a really, I don't know, it's one of those places that when you stand there, you feel like there's spirits around or something. You know, it's just it's a really interesting place. They planted thousands of trees, red and white pine, Norway spruce, white cedar. It transitioned into a prisoner of war camp during World War II. The Cayuga County Processors and Growers Corporation took advantage of these men living over there. They were paid, and like Cheryl said, they were treated pretty well. The employer, or the farmer, was responsible to transport the prisoners to the field, accompanied by one guard, regardless of number of prisoners. And this map is showing the prisoner of war camps around the country, and that was June 1944. You can look at all the ones in western New York. The U.S. Biological Survey, in the first one, that is the early version of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Another photo. The main roads are still there and are driven, are still used, but I can't tell. And you can still, so now we're in the 40s and how much of the land is cleared still at this point. World War II ends, farming dwindles. there was all of the buildings were removed except for, or all of the barracks, I should say, were removed except one. It's called Scout Camp. That red circle, so this is CCC Pond. That is where the CCC and Prisoner of War Camp was, and Scout Camp, and then that is the only remaining buildings to this day. Mid-30s, new manager John Battram and his family takes over. This picture I snagged out of this book again. He's seen holding a couple pheasants, a hen and a rooster. So ringneck pheasants is what you see today. They're raised as game species. Battram was kind of renowned in his operation, and I'll show you in a few slides, of what, and Cheryl spoke of it, the volume of birds he was working with. And he actually was a supplier of birds to other game farms in the area, one being in Elmira, one being in Ithaca. The Ithaca game farm is the only game farm left in the state, and they only raise pheasants. Ringneck pheasants are not native to North America. They're from Asia, and they are only raised and stocked for sport. Yesterday, we had 2 at the theater. They stock them here on the island still, and here at this property, on DEC property. Before the ringneck pheasants, they were breeding, so I read Chinese blood pheasant. So there was a Chinese pheasant and a blood pheasant, but not a Chinese blood pheasant. So I picked blood pheasant, and that's the little guy up top, and then the blackneck pheasant, which looks pretty similar to our ringneck. And that's the ringneck pheasant. Here's a picture of those brooders, all laid out. Okay, here's when things started to get a little weird, in my opinion. So remember that the state owned the island now. They started doing waterfowl research and propagation as wildlife managers and biologists all over the country. I'll go as far as to say, we don't breed native species for sport. There might be reintroduction or endangered species that are worked on to be released, but we're not raising herds of zebras to go out and, hunt. So, but that's what they were doing over there. And they were breeding and raising species of ducks that aren't native breeders to this area. They migrate through here. You can see redheads definitely here right now out on the lake. The northern pintails and the gadwall will migrate through as well, but they're breeding in the Midwest, up into Canada, down through the Dakotas, Nebraska, and the Minnesota prairie pothole region. But we were breeding them here for sport. They were actually living in the wild, out on the ponds, named breeder, brooder, goose, gander, black duck, wood duck, pintail, very original, with clipped wings. They were out there, so they couldn't get away. They weren't hunted, but they couldn't get away. And somewhere I was reading, it might have been in this book, or one of the DEC reports, that they were having a big issue with mallards and black ducks coming in, which are native breeders here, that were basically bullying their stock. And they had to do some predator control that included coyote, of course, fox, great horned owl. I read of some kind of pull mechanism. I don't know if they had a bait or what, but the owl would land on top and become entangled somehow and fall to the ground, and then they euthanize it somehow. Killing owls is not allowed, not legal. But that, that was something very interesting that was going on during the 50s into the 60s. So the once overgrown, forgotten farmlands were now becoming wooded, and deer populations started to explode. Woodies, this is a quote or a little chunk from, I think, the document here that I pulled. Deer populations have been high. Woody reproduction has been limited to species unattracted to deer. Ground cover in the wooded areas is such that it's only rarely used by nesting ducks. So we're having that problem still today. You can go places into the woods where it looks like a park almost. The understory has been completely browsed by deer. So in the 1950s, they started a hunt program. They had a one-day hunt. They don't know how many for sure hunters showed up because they were inundated. 1,300 to 1,700 gun hunters harvested 100 to 150 deer. That's let's go on the low end, 343 hunters per square mile with guns. I would go over there 2020 during hunting season when there's regulation and blaze orange and whatnot. But amazingly, no fatalities or injuries were reported. Somehow. So that was 1 year only. They were like, okay, we can't do that again. There was also a game manager out there who was just being stalked, basically, harassed, because there were permits, and then the permits were gone, and he wasn't actually the permit issuer. They had to hire extra admin secretaries to take on the influx of people wanting to get on there, and it was just like a free-for-all. In the 60s, additional lands were purchased by the Land Acquisition Bond Act of 1962. Another 114.7 acres were purchased, and that was in surrounding the island, so probably just over the river. And now private farming was being starting up again, leased farming, mostly corn and hay crops. It's written by George Gage, who was living out there, and he wrote, "Howland Island is an exceptional place, a blend of wooded drumlins and marshes. The Indians valued it for thousands of years before the coming of modern man. It remains a place of insular beauty which your photography didn't even begin to capture, and it also provides an excellent example of the art or science of wildlife management. New Yorkers and the department can be very proud of their Howland Island. I know I am." Now, 70s into the 80s, the last building Cheryl mentioned that was used as the caretaker's home was burned by the Port Byron Fire Department. The only things on the island that tell you that people lived out there are, you can find old electrical poles, utility poles, with like rusty wires hanging off here and there. You can find them along the roadways. And I'm sure if you knew where things were, you could go digging and find glass and metal and things like that. Okay, so now we're getting into more current times. Becomes, in 1992, look at that acronym, NYSDEC-NOMO WMA. That's the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, Northern Montezuma Wildlife Management Area. That's the refuge, and we're NOMO up here, or the MAC, Montezuma Audubon Center. Dave Odell, who's around and one of our volunteers, he's on our the Audubon Center's board. He's in the Friends group. He became the supervisory wildlife biologist for many years. He retired. He's served 35 years, not all as manager out here at Howland Island on Morgan Road, but with the state. Ducks Unlimited became involved and offered, and still do, financial contributions as well as support. Just an example, over on the other side of the Seneca River down the Loop Road area, there's a Loop Road marsh that was just completed this past year. Ducks Unlimited was able to provide engineers and people who could do the mapping for the state, because the state doesn't have the capacity or the money or the time. They're very short-staffed over there, and so Ducks Unlimited stepped in and provided that service to get the project done. That's a Canada goose sitting on a muskrat hut. In a lot of the ponds there's these little hummocks sticking up, and that was habitat created for Canada geese because there weren't enough. They like to nest on these little mounds, like muskrat huts, or if you get out there and you look around, you'll see these, or even just naturally occurring like little hummocks of cattails that have folded over, whatever. They will nest on there, and there weren't enough. Some animals you can see out there today and that they manage for. Cerulean warbler, which is a migratory bird. They are in like Brazil right now, but they'll come back and they nest on the island. A short-eared owl, which is a state endangered species. I know the picture's not the best picture of the owl, but that's what they look like when you see them. Far away, in poor lighting, because they come out an hour before dusk, and they're flapping low over the marsh or the grassland. A fisher study that's going on currently. So fisher and river otter were both pretty much extirpated from the Finger Lakes, western New York, for habitat loss and over-harvesting. And the Fisher project is to do a study. They create these bait baskets with beaver meat in chicken wire. They attach it to the tree. Around the edge are gun brushes, and then there's a camera looking at the tree. So we can see who's coming, and then the gun brushes pick up fur to get an idea of individuals. Lots of other visitors come. Flying squirrels, other weasels, birds. I went out to check one once and there were chickadees on it. So that's pretty cool. They're doing that right now currently mine did her grad work in the Montezuma area. There was a river otter reintroduction program back in the 90s where river otters were caught from other parts of the state, brought to Cornell, fattened up, vaccinated, and then re-released in the Finger Lakes. And now we have a very healthy otter population. I see them around Howland Island. I found tracks out back. We had someone hunting out back earlier this year and had an otter underneath his tree stand. And so her project was, this graduate from ESF, was to put cameras out at suspected otter sites to see them coming and going. And she was actually also collecting scat to get genetic information from. The 80s, early 90s is when kind of the shift of the focus went from game management to all species management. So the game management are species that you can hunt. All species management, you're not supposed to hunt short-eared owls, for example. They are providing habitat and improving habitat for these animals outside of game species. The kind of unofficial mission is to provide recreation dependent on wildlife. So hunting, fishing, trapping, bird watching, hiking, biking, snowshoe, cross-country, horseback riding. People sometimes ask for trail maps, and we don't have trail maps because its first purpose is not a trail system. It's a wildlife management area. You're allowed to access it. There are roads that are great to get around the island on, but there's not established trails. Sometimes there was flooding. You gotta remember the whole kind of perimeter of the island is floodplain. And that's the beauty of a wetland. It absorbs and releases water seasonally. So water gets high, it gets spread out horizontally over the wetlands. It doesn't create these massive sluices of flood water that are eroding and washing houses away. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So now here we are on the island looking back towards the mainland. Those vehicles are on the mainland. They still stock pheasant, they still do timber harvest. They'll lease it out, allow loggers to go in and take certain things of a certain size. Logging can be a really sustainable way to use natural resources. They lease the farmland still today. There's about 500 to 1,000 acres in use right now. Some of the stipulations are no neonicotinoid. So I wanted to know what that was. And it's a new class of relative. So it's a class of insecticides chemically related to nicotine. Name literally means new nicotine-like insecticides. And the nicotine, it acts on certain types of receptors in the nerve synapse. But it's a really broad spectrum insecticide. So I'm sure you can imagine why that is bad and why that's not allowed. The farmer must leave 3 to 5% of the crop standing. So, and there's farming done on DEC land all over the state and around the area. So if you ever drive by a field, you'll see a little DEC signs on the corner, marking the corners, and you see a random strip of corn standing. That's why. And it's left for wildlife throughout the winter. And the money comes right back to northern Montezuma that is generated from the lease. It doesn't go back to the DEC. It comes right back here to be generated back into habitat restoration. And northern Montezuma has the largest farming agreement in the entire state on wildlife management lands. It's a really big responsibility, and they're really short-staffed over there. I don't know how they do it, but they're doing it. Other projects include, besides the Fisher study, duck banding, a rail project they were doing, bird surveys like marsh bird, eagle, waterfowl surveys, and bat surveys during the summer. And that's a picture of Jim Eckler standing next to a Kentucky coffee tree, which are found over there. In 2012, the new bridge that you know today was built. It was raised quite a bit, and I haven't seen it flooded over, but last year, May 18th, I took Girl Scouts out to go paddling. We launched from Morgan Road, which is a little bit south. We wanted to paddle up north, go under this bridge, and go up around the northern end of the island. There was 6 inches of clearance under that bridge. So we couldn't go under the bridge, but we did paddle into the forest because that had 4 feet of water in it. And it was open to the public now to access the island because access was really limited to those who had the privilege of being physically mobile and those who were adventurous. You still got to be a little adventurous to get out to explore the island, but at least you can get out to the mid-island. This is from the mainland looking onto the island, and you can see on either side there that low marshland, that is all floodplain. There's a beautiful parking area up there as well with a kiosk that they try to keep information on about hunting. Just a little disclaimer that if you are enjoying any state-owned land, there is hunting allowed on it during the hunting seasons. If you really want to get down to it, hunting, trapping, and fishing generates money. There's a tax on licenses, gear, things like that, that gets generated back into the conservation fund and is distributed to the state. Oh, hunting is management, absolutely. There's a science to it. It has to be done. We'll be swimming through deer if we don't. So if you want to hunt waterfowl in New York State or in the country, you have to purchase a duck stamp. They're $25. You can get them at any post office. They are different every year. Hunters do, but that is a great way for you, those of us who don't hunt, to give it back $25 a year in a very simple way. And you have a cool little memento. No ATVs, no snowmobiles, just your feet or hooves or snowshoes or bike. So here, the water's really high, but this is a gravel boat launch right here. So that's a really nice little addition. So to our left and our right is the Seneca River. Over here is south, that's north. This is a really cool place to paddle, but I would suggest doing it in the earlier half of the season because the water can get low and it gets choked out with plants and you can be crawling through plants, which is not really fun. If you go on the other side where the Erie Canal is, that's fine and open, but this side is not very fun to go through later. And I would not put a motorboat in there. I don't know if people go through there in motorboats, but there are snags and all sorts of things in that water. Up until like maybe beginning of June, it's okay to be on, and then I will go back till September because you will be sucked dry by mosquitoes. I do offer a birding tour in May where people can come in the van with me and I drive onto the island beyond the gates. That's only offered once, maybe twice. There's aerial pictures. This is the northern end of the island looking south. That is the Seneca River. They have very distinct shapes, these ponds, so they're easy to match. And they had to go around the drumlins, which you can actually see some of the drumlins on here. Drumlins are glacial remnants that were created both by erosion and deposition. They're north-south oriented. They look like a spoon flipped upside down. They have a steeper northern edge tapering down the southern edge. And we have the second largest field of them in the world in Wayne County after Switzerland. Claim to fame, we should make bumper stickers. But you can see them. They had to dig, these wetlands around these hills. All right, thank you so much for coming.
Okay, so going up to Howland Island, going up to the Montezuma Audubon Center, and that's all we have time for today. So hope we see you again next week. Bring up my final little video here. Walk in the park. Is a